Winter 1943. The skies over Germany still belonged to the Luftwaffe. American B-17 and B-24 bomber formations pushing deep into enemy territory paid a heavy price. Dozens of aircraft lost on every mission. At 25,000 feet, where the air thinned and engines strained at their limits, the escorting P-47s and P-38s often could not keep up. The U.S. pilots knew it well. They needed something stronger, faster, and with greater range. Strangely, the ultimate solution did not come from a new aircraft design, but from a purple barrel of fuel. At Wright Field, Ohio, engineers of the U.S. Army Air Forces and chemists from Shell and Standard Oil were conducting obscure experiments. They were not building a new engine, but developing a fuel with an octane rating higher than anything that had ever existed, a gasoline capable of withstanding extreme compression without pre-ignition. The goal sounded simple: allow engines to produce more power without damage. But in the world of piston engines, that was the chemical equivalent of adding hundreds of horsepower. They called it grade 150 fuel, or simply purple fuel, for its distinctive dyed color. In the test tubes of Wright Field, the liquid gleamed like metallic juice, deep violet, shimmering under fluorescent light as if alive. Behind that color hid a formula so complex only a few team members fully understood it. They blended toluene, xylene, and aromatic hydrocarbons with tetraethyl, lead, once considered too toxic for widespread use. Create a gasoline resistant to detonation or knocking. When the purple fuel was fed into a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the engine of the P-51 Mustang, the gauges went wild. At 75 inches of manifold pressure, the engine neither knocked nor shook, running smoothly as silk. The power needle leapt past 1,700 horsepower, more than 200 above normal maximum. Flight tests recorded 448 iridium at 25,000 feet. One engineer wrote in his report, "No structural changes, no new supercharger, just fuel." The airplane became a monster. To grasp its significance, one must recall the situation of late 1943. Despite Allied industrial superiority, German aircraft still dominated mid-altitude combat. The W190 and Bf109G, with Daimler-Benz and BMW engines optimized for Europe's fuels and climate, remained formidable. Germany lacked 150 octane fuel but had C3 fuel, roughly 130 octane, enough for decent performance. Yet because the Reich lacked crude oil, it relied on synthetic fuel made from coal, costly and inconsistent in quality. America, by contrast, had an abundance of oil and the revolutionary catalytic cracking process, invented by French engineer Eugène Houdry, allowing mass production of exceptionally high-octane fuel. The first reports from Wright Field reached the U.S. War Department in early 1944. Results were so striking that General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, ordered full-scale flight trials. A P-51B squadron was chosen, each aircraft filled with 150-grade fuel. When the boost lever engaged, the Merlin's tone changed, deeper, throatier, like caged thunder. The Mustang shot skyward, the runway vanishing beneath. Within minutes, it climbed past 25,000 feet, still with power to spare. The test pilot noted, "The airplane feels like it's been waiting to be unleashed." Every indicator exceeded design limits without structural failure. The Merlin 61, previously restricted to 61 inches of boost, could now sustain 75 inches for minutes on end, with cylinder head temperatures, oil pressure, and RPM all within safe margins. In effect, every P-51 in Europe could become a supercharged version of itself, simply by changing fuel. Reports quickly reached Britain. The Royal Air Force, long experienced with 130-grade fuel in its Spitfires, was intrigued. RAF Command approved combat trials during Operation Crossbow, the campaign to intercept Germany's V-1 flying bombs. These drones streaked at over 400 km/h, nearly impossible to catch using standard fuel. But with purple fuel, Spitfire Mach-9s gained nearly 30 mph, enough for pilots to nudge a V-1's wing and send it tumbling. Within weeks, interception rates soared, and production of 150-grade fuel was authorized for both U.S. and British Air Forces. Producing it, however, was a monumental challenge. Grade 150 required exact chemical ratios and ultra-pure refining. A small deviation could drop the octane rating, or ruin engines entirely. Yet America's oil industry, backed by the government, rose to the task. Within 6 months, They had a separate network of purple-painted storage tanks labeled 150 grade, aviation use only, and tankers were crossing the Atlantic carrying millions of gallons to supply the 8th Air Force and RAF by mid-1944. When the first shipments reached England, a new era of air warfare began. Pilots described the feeling as like getting a new airplane. The P-51s were now faster than the Me-109s and could maintain that speed at altitudes the Germans could not match. On bomber escort runs to Berlin, Mustangs surged ahead, tore through the sky, and swung back to guard the formation, something impossible before. One pilot from the 4th Fighter Group recalled, "With the purple fuel, the Merlin didn't scream from strain, it sang." The miracle of 150 grade fuel was not just in speed, but in strategy. It allowed thousands of existing fighters to perform like next-generation aircraft. While Germany invested in experimental jets like the Me-262 or Ta-152, the Allies achieved similar results by changing chemistry, not machinery, a true chemical weapon that killed no one directly but transformed the war. Following successful trials on May 1, 1944, the War Department authorized full deployment of 150 grade fuel for all P-51 and P-47 units in Europe. The effect was immediate. Bomber losses halved, Luftwaffe losses doubled. German pilots reported American planes flying at impossible speeds, but intelligence officers dismissed it. No new model had been introduced. Only the purple fuel, quietly working its magic in every cylinder. In hindsight, this revolution stands as a classic example of applied science in warfare. Not every breakthrough comes from new engines or weapons. Sometimes a change in chemical formula can tip the balance of history. Grade 150 fuel was no glamorous icon like the Mustang or Spitfire, yet it was the chemical heart that pushed those machines beyond the limits of metal and heat to become legends. When the war ended, the purple fuel faded into obscurity, replaced by jet and turbine technology. But among the pilots who flew in 1944, it remained spoken of with reverence. The fuel that turned ordinary Mustangs into 490 Manuf demons, helping the Allies reclaim the skies over Europe. When the first barrels of purple fuel reached Britain in the spring of 1944, the air war between the Allies and Nazi Germany still seemed evenly balanced. But beneath the roar of engines and the scream of machine guns, another, quieter war was unfolding, one fought in laboratories, in refineries, and inside vast chemical reactors. It was the war of fuel, where victory came not from the courage of pilots, but from mastery over molecules of hydrocarbon. Since the early 1930s, aeronautical engineers had understood that the power of a piston engine depended directly on the quality of its fuel. The octane rating, a measure of resistance to pre-ignition, marked the line between performance and destruction. The higher the number, the more the engine could compress the air-fuel mixture, producing greater power without knocking the premature combustion inside cylinders. At low octane, the mixture burned unevenly, damaging pistons and bending rods. On the battlefield, that meant death. During World War II, octane became a strategic weapon, as vital as uranium in the nuclear race. Germany entered the war with the world's most advanced mechanical engineering, but without oil. The Allies, especially the United States, had it in abundance. The Ruhr Valley was rich in coal but had almost no large oil fields. So, even before the war, Germany had invested heavily in synthetic fuel plants, built on the Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius hydrogenation processes. Chemically, these were marvels, converting carbon from coal into liquid hydrocarbons to produce gasoline, diesel, and lubricants. But the price was immense in energy, time, and efficiency. Synthetic fuels from coal had lower octane ratings than those refined from crude oil. Despite efforts to improve them with aromatic additives such as toluene, artificial iso-octane, and tetraethyl lead, the common B4 fuel used by the Luftwaffe reached only 95 to 100 octane. A limited amount of C3 fuel, around 130 octane, was reserved for elite fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109K. But C3 was prohibitively expensive and scarce. Each plant could produce only a few thousand tons per month, nowhere near the hundreds of thousands required by the Air Force. Across the Atlantic, the United States entered the war with virtually limitless oil reserves. From Texas to California, hundreds of wells gushed daily, More importantly, America possessed the revolutionary catalytic cracking process, developed by French chemist Eugène Houdry and refined by Standard Oil in Texaco. This method not only increased gasoline yields from crude, but also produced short-chain hydrocarbons with exceptionally high octane. It enabled the U.S. and Britain to mass-produce 100, 130, and eventually 150-grade fuel, something Germany's brilliant mechanics could never replicate. The gap was not just in numbers, but in logistics. Each Mustang, Spitfire, or Thunderbolt consumed hundreds of gallons per mission. Thanks to vast refineries and tightly integrated supply lines, the Allies could fill millions of barrels of 150-grade fuel, ship them across the Atlantic, and distribute them to hundreds of forward airfields within weeks. Germany, by contrast, produced every barrel of synthetic fuel at triple the cost, under 300 atmospheres of pressure, then had to move it by rail, constantly threatened by Allied bombers. By mid-1944, when the U.S. Army Air Forces began strategic bombing raids on synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Pulitz, Berlin, and Brooks, the Luftwaffe began to starve. Fighter units were ordered to cut training hours and avoid flying unless absolutely necessary. Young pilots entered combat with fewer than 10 flight hours, a tragic figure. Meanwhile, at British bases, American pilots averaged over 200 hours of training. With so much fuel available, they could fly day and night. Thus, fuel science became the dividing line between experience and sacrifice. To counter the Allies' advantage, German engineers sought mechanical miracles. They developed nitrous oxide injection, GM1 systems for Daimler-Benz DB605 engines to boost power at altitude, and experimented with methanol water injection, MW50, to cool the cylinders and prevent detonation under short bursts of boost pressure. But these were stopgap solutions. Their effectiveness still depended on the base fuel's quality. If the gasoline was weak, MW50 only delayed failure for minutes before overheating set in. In short, Germany was forcing metal beyond its limits, without a strong enough chemical foundation to sustain it. Meanwhile, at Wright Field in Farnborough, American and British scientists kept refining the purple fuel. They added ethylene debromide to neutralize lead deposits, reducing residue and extending spark plug life. Tests showed the fuel could endure compression pressures 150% higher than standard iso-octane, and spontaneous ignition occurred only at around 500 degrees Celsius, an almost unthinkable threshold for piston engines. This allowed the Merlin, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, and the Allison V1710 to generate more power while maintaining reliability. Test reports described the detonation margin of engines using 150-grade fuel as so wide as to be practically limitless. Strategically, these differences created a domino effect. A single gallon of 150-grade fuel meant an extra mile per hour, a few hundred more feet of climb, and several seconds of survival in dogfights. When Mustangs fueled with purple gasoline flew at 440-450 amps, the Me-109s and FW-190s, no matter the skill of their pilots, could neither pursue nor escape in time. American escort groups began to dominate Europe's skies, from Normandy to Berlin. The Luftwaffe no longer controlled the air. It merely survived within shrinking, defensive bubbles around its bases. Yet this chemical divide was more than a tale of formulas and reactions. It reflected a philosophical split between two industrial worlds. Germany believed precision engineering could offset material shortages. The U.S. and Britain pursued total industrialization, seeking not perfection in individual machines, but consistency in mass output. While German engineers polished the DB605 to mechanical perfection, their American counterparts refined cracking processes to produce millions more gallons of superior gasoline. In the end, that difference in philosophy determined the outcome. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Synthetic fuel plants lay in ruins. Production had fallen by over 90%. A report from the German Air Ministry admitted, "The Luftwaffe can no longer operate on a strategic scale. Fuel shortages are the primary cause." Meanwhile, the Allies not only sustained their daily bombing campaigns, but even began stockpiling for post-war operations. Along Britain's coasts, rows of vast purple storage tanks stood as silent reminders of an unassailable industrial advantage. In retrospect, people often praise the P-51 Mustang, the Merlin engine, or the tactics of commanders like Doolittle and Spaatz. Yet few remember that every Mustang was born of two kinds of power, mechanical and chemical. Without 150-grade fuel, the Merlin would have been just another good windy 400-horsepower engine, and the Mustang only a mid-range fighter, not the immortal icon of World War II. This was the true meaning of the chemical gap, not merely the difference between two fuels, but between two mindsets, one that trusted craftsmanship and mechanical genius, and another that trusted applied science and industrial scale. When purple fuel coursed through the Merlin's veins, it didn't just ignite the air-fuel mixture, it burned away Germany's illusion that engineering brilliance alone could triumph without an equal command of energy. By early 1945, the truth was undeniable. The Luftwaffe was paralyzed, not for lack of planes or pilots, but because there was nothing left to pour into their tanks. Meanwhile, thousands of Mustangs took off each morning from English airfields, their purple fuel shimmering in the sunlight. That contrast, emptiness on one side, abundance on the other, was the war in miniature, an industrial empire that mastered energy against a war machine shackled by its own chemical limits. When the final shots faded and Europe's skies cleared, the scientists who had worked on a 150-grade fuel realized they had helped forge one of World War II's most overlooked miracles, not merely an invention but a revolution in thought, where something as humble as fuel became the weapon that decided the fate of a continent. When the tests with the new 150-grade purple fuel concluded at Wright Field, the figures on the power charts forced every engineer, pilot, and commander to take a second look. That fuel had turned the P-51 Mustang, already one of the finest fighters of World War II, into something entirely different. Once the symbol of perfect balance between range, speed, and maneuverability, the Mustang now, with nothing more than a change of fuel, became a supersonic warrior, a new creature in the European skies where the limits of physics were pushed dozens of miles per hour further. The Merlin V1650 engine had always possessed immense potential. Built under license by Packard from Rolls-Royce, it featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, an engineering marvel that maintained strong power above 25,000 feet. Yet throughout 1943, the Merlin remained constrained by 100 or 130 octane fuel. Engineers knew the engine could withstand higher compression, but they were bound by aviation's greatest fear, detonation, or knock. If fuel ignited prematurely, pistons could shatter, crankshafts bend, and the engine fail completely. So, even knowing it could deliver more, they dared not unleash its full potential. When 150-grade fuel arrived, those limits vanished. Its octane rating was so high that the Merlin could handle boost pressures of 75 inches of mercury, levels once considered suicidal with standard gasoline. The first tests showed power climbing from 1,490 HP to 1,720 HP, occasionally reaching 1,800 HP in cool air. No redesigns, no new turbines or propellers, just this extraordinary purple fuel. Combined with the Mustang's already excellent cooling system and aerodynamics, the results were stunning. At 25,000 feet, top speed rose by over 30 mph, reaching 448 mph, equal to Germany's Focke-Wulf FW-190D and often faster. More importantly, the rate of climb jumped from 3,200 ft/min to nearly 4,000. Letting American pilots reach advantageous positions in minutes, an invaluable edge in combat. Starting in May 1944, the 150-grade fuel was officially issued to the U.S. 8th Air Force and the Royal Air Force. Airfields such as Debden, Leiston, Bottisham, and Biggin Hill began receiving drums marked with purple stripes reading, "Purple Fuel, Grade 150." Pilots were skeptical at first. How could mere fuel make such a difference? But once they pushed the throttle to war emergency power and felt the airframe tremble as the airspeed needle swept past 440 mph, they believed. One Spitfire McKee-14 pilot recalled, "I heard the Merlin roar like a beast, and the plane leapt from the ground. I'd never seen it climb so fast." The difference showed not only in numbers, but in combat. During the Normandy campaign in the summer of 1944, Mustangs burning 150-grade fuel could escort bombers deep into France and still have enough to engage enemy fighters on the return. German pilots in FW-190s and Bf-109s, long used to matching the Mustang in speed, were astonished as their opponents now pulled away easily, both horizontally and vertically. In the campaign against V-1 flying bombs, the effect was even clearer. Earlier, Spitfire Make-Is and Tempest Make-Vs had to dive from altitude to catch the 400 MEF V-1s. With purple fuel, they could chase them level, or even faster, nearly doubling interception rates. The P-51, Spitfire, and Tempest became true missile hunters. Pilots described the sensation vividly. Flipping the boost override switch and shoving the throttle forward, manifold pressure surged, the Merlin's tone deepened, and acceleration slammed them into their seats. The broad paddle blade propeller spun near its physical limit, the climb indicator needle racing upward as if pulled by an invisible hand. Within seconds, a Mustang could break free of enemy gunfire, a life-saving ability in close-quarters combat. Amazingly, all this required no logistical overhaul. The 150-grade fuel was fully compatible with the Mustang's systems. Ground crews merely cleaned spark plugs and ensured airtight induction seals to capture every ounce of performance. Mechanics at Leiston joked, "We don't need to upgrade the airplane, just what it drinks." The impact spread quickly. Once the 8th Air Force adopted it widely, escort pilot survival rates rose dramatically. Mustang groups not only protected B-17 and B-24 bombers deep into Germany, but began hunting enemy fighters on their own. Thus emerged the free hunt tactic. P-51 squadrons detached from bomber formations to destroy any Luftwaffe aircraft encountered. With their superior speed and range, they achieved what no Air Force had before: complete air supremacy over enemy territory. At first, German command refused to believe the reports. Frontline pilots describing faster Mustangs were accused of exaggeration. One Luftwaffe officer wrote, "It's impossible for the Mustang to outclimb the 109 unless the Americans have magic." But as P-51 appeared deeper and higher over Germany, escorting bombers to Berlin and Leipzig at 30,000 feet, denial turned to dread. The Allies possessed something beyond any Daimler-Benz DB605 or Jumo 213 engine the Reich could produce. Psychologically, the change was profound. For Mustang pilots, 150-grade fuel meant absolute confidence. They knew that if caught at a disadvantage, a full-throttle climb could rocket them to safety. That trust was an invisible weapon. In dogfights where hesitation measured in milliseconds meant life or death, belief in one's machine was decisive. In post-war analyses, American engineers and generals called the adoption of 150-grade fuel a chemical strategic lever. Without building thousands of new planes, they had transformed existing ones through chemistry, proof of the American industrial philosophy, victory through intellect and production as much as steel and gunpowder. In hindsight, the P-51 on purple fuel represented a rare harmony of mechanics, chemistry, and tactics. Mechanics provided the perfect frame. Chemistry delivered energy beyond expectation. Tactics exploited both to the fullest. The Mustang thus became the purest image of American industrial might, powerful, efficient, and refined down to the last molecule of gasoline. By late 1944, as the skies over Europe blazed with endless bombing missions, P-51s still led the formations, their engines thundering with the distinct tone of purple fuel. In the pale winter sun, white contrails stretched behind them like signatures of a new era, one in which war was decided not just by bullets and steel, but by the invisible chemical reactions inside the Merlin's combustion chambers. In just a few months, what seemed a small technical change had become a revolutionary leap. And every time a Mustang streaked past at nearly 450 mph, the world understood that warfare had entered a new chapter, a chapter written in speed, science, and the incredible power of that purple fuel. The arrival of 150-grade purple fuel on the European battlefield was not merely a technical milestone, it was a psychological turning point in the struggle for air supremacy. When the P-51 Mustangs, Spitfires, and Tempests were fed this new fuel, they didn't just become faster, they became symbols of something the Germans were beginning to lose: faith in victory. By early summer 1944, the skies over France and Western Germany had become an arena of two worlds. On one side were American and British pilots, confident in their overwhelming industrial and scientific power. On the other, the exhausted flyers of the Luftwaffe, worn down by years of combat, now facing an enemy not only more numerous, but faster, higher climbing, and seemingly invincible. Within just weeks of the fuel's introduction, squadrons of the U.S. 8th Air Force began reporting results that exceeded every expectation. The once costly daylight bombing missions, previously devastated by the lack of long-range escorts, were now shielded by Storm Riders. P-51 Mustangs capable of accompanying B-17s and B-24s from England all the way to Berlin and back. Pilots who had survived earlier raids described the transformation in 2 words: a miracle. Once they faced hundreds of German fighters attacking like wolves. Now swarms of Mustangs, faster and more agile, shredded Luftwaffe formations before they could even reach interception altitude. The psychological shock spread quickly through the Luftwaffe. German pilots, who had once viewed the Mustang as a dangerous but manageable foe, gave it a new nickname: Der Teufel mit den Flügeln, the devil with wings. They reported that the moment they heard the high-pitched scream of the Merlin engine under maximum boost, they knew the American had engaged full power and that escape was impossible. One Bf-109 pilot wrote in his diary, "We pushed our throttles to the stops, but the Mustang kept closing. It doesn't fly. It lunges like a shell." This imbalance shattered what little morale remained in the Luftwaffe after Normandy's defeat. By mid-1944, as Allied armies poured into France, German fighter units retreated to defend the homeland, starved of fuel, short of training time, and now facing enemies with 1.5 times their power. Some commanders tried to compensate through tactics, diving attacks from altitude, quick energy strikes before disengaging. But Mustangs on purple fuel could climb faster and sustain pursuit longer, rendering Germany's hit-and-run tactics obsolete. A strange pattern began to appear in combat statistics. German aircraft losses rose sharply while Mustang losses fell. By late 1943, U.S. daylight bomber losses had sometimes reached 6% per mission. By autumn 1944, after the full deployment of 150-grade fuel, losses dropped to 1.5%. Military analysts called it the 150-grade effect, a combination of speed, climb, and morale, magnified by the pilots' faith in their technology. For American pilots, the new fuel didn't just help them survive, it made them feel untouchable. They knew that if pursued, they could push the throttle to war emergency power, hear the Merlin roar, and rocket out of gun range within seconds. From defensive escorts, they evolved into aggressive hunters. The P-51 squadrons were soon authorized to break formation and free hunt German fighters on the return leg, destroying the Luftwaffe at its source. Even civilians on the ground could sense the shift. Germans who had long been told that no one can cross the Rhine by air now looked up to see Mustangs circling over Berlin. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously remarked after spotting them himself, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." That sentence captured more than a military defeat. It marked a collapse of spirit. The P-51 running on purple fuel was no longer just an airplane. It was a flying manifesto of American industrial dominance. While German factories lay in ruins, their fuel supplies cut off, and new pilots barely trained, the United States was producing millions of gallons of high-grade aviation fuel every month, ensuring that every Mustang took off at full power. Even the Allies were astonished. RAF pilots, accustomed to flying Spitfire Mach-9s on 130-octane fuel, found their machines transformed, almost feral, on the new blend. One British pilot recalled, "When I hit full boost, the plane shook like it wanted to tear its wings off." But that feeling, breaking through your limits, was indescribable. You felt like you were riding a storm. The fuel's psychological impact extended even within Germany's own ranks. While older fighters like the Bf-109G and FW-190A struggled to keep up with Mustangs, a few elite units equipped with Me-262 jets or FW-190D, Doris became the Reich's last hope. But even they were crippled by fuel shortages. Each sortie consumed enormous amounts of synthetic gasoline. Meanwhile, the Americans could refuel endlessly with their purple fuel reserves. The balance of the air war tilted irrevocably. This shift also shaped the mindset of American commanders. General James Doolittle, head of the 8th Air Force, understood that technological superiority had to be fully exploited. He ordered his units using 150-grade fuel to fight not defensively, but offensively, to carry the war directly into Germany's skies. His strategy, powered by the purple fuel's speed and endurance, broke the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its own homeland. From mid-1944 to early 1945, the P-51 was credited with destroying over 4,900 German aircraft, an unprecedented figure in aviation history. Behind those numbers lay not just pilot skill, but a chemical revolution, the highest octane gasoline ever used in combat. Yet the fuel's greatest legacy wasn't measured in data or speed, it was in belief. For Americans, it proved that victory could be engineered through science, by improving what already existed. For Germans, it was a brutal reminder that they had lost the industrial race, a battle no ace or miracle weapon could reverse. And so, as the winter of 1944 settled over Europe, the gray skies of Germany echoed with the deep roar of Merlin engines and the faint scent of burnt purple fuel. Each streaking contrail across the heavens declared a new truth. The sky now belonged to the Allies, not because they had more planes, but because they had understood more, dared more, and learned that in modern war, true power lies not only in steel and fire, but in every violet-blue drop of fuel burning above the clouds. As the skies over Europe still burned with smoke in late 1944, people began to realize a paradoxical truth. World War II was not merely a war of tanks, guns, and planes. It was a war of fuel. Every drop of gasoline ignited in a Merlin cylinder, every ton of oil refined in the massive plants of Texas or Louisiana, was a chemical bullet fired into the heart of German industry. And in that war, the purple 150-grade fuel was not just a technical upgrade. It was the strategic weapon of America's industrial civilization. From the very beginning, the United States understood that victory could not rest on manpower alone, but on the power to produce and supply fuel. In 1940, even before joining the war, America already had over 200 major refineries. By 1944, that number had nearly doubled, producing more than 7 billion gallons of fuel annually. But the true difference lay not in quantity, but in quality, something that even German engineering genius could not replicate. At the heart of this fuel revolution stood an often overlooked figure, Eugène Houdry, a French-born engineer whose invention of catalytic cracking transformed modern refining. His process broke down heavy hydrocarbon molecules into lighter, faster-burning compounds with superior anti-knock properties. It was this innovation that enabled the U.S. to mass-produce high-octane fuels, first 100, then 130, and finally the legendary 150 grade, the pinnacle of wartime petroleum chemistry. Germany, cut off from natural oil since the war's onset, relied on synthetic fuel derived from coal via the Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius processes. Ingenious but inefficient, these methods required enormous energy and yielded fuel with much lower octane ratings. German chemists tried to boost performance with additives like tetrethyl lead, toluene, or isooctane, but supplies were scarce. When Allied bombers destroyed plants at Leuna, Pölitz, and Bohlen, Germany's fuel output collapsed by 80% in the latter half of 1944. Across the Atlantic, American refineries never slept. In Baytown, Texas, the beating heart of Standard Oil, massive steel tanks held the secret purple fuel. Known colloquially as Purple Passion, it was shipped by sea, packed in drums, and pumped through transcontinental pipelines to British ports. From there, each drop was poured into the tanks of Mustangs, Spitfires, and Tempests, the chemical warriors of the sky. The U.S. Army Air Forces recognized that 150-grade fuel was more than a technical advantage. It was a strategic multiplier. With it, existing aircraft could be transformed into world-beating weapons without waiting for new designs. The 8th Air Force alone consumed over 53 million gallons of the high-octane blend, while total Allied usage exceeded 200 million gallons. Those numbers may seem dry, but in pure energy, that was enough to circle the Earth millions of times. Energy transmuted into victory. General James Doolittle, the man who led the daring 1942 Tokyo raid, understood this better than anyone. It was he who championed the widespread adoption of 150-grade fuel in the 8th Air Force. "We don't just win with bullets," he often said. "We win with what burns inside the cylinders." To him, Every barrel of high-octane fuel was an invisible cannon. The results proved him right. After the introduction of the purple fuel, kill ratios against German fighters nearly doubled, while bomber losses were cut in half. For America, this was proof of its industrial war philosophy, that science and mass production could shift the balance of power without changing the weapons themselves. While Germany spent years designing new aircraft, the U.S. gained superiority simply by altering its fuel chemistry. That flexibility, combined with industrial scale, allowed America to turn scientific knowledge into raw combat power. Strategically, the 150 grade program symbolized something even greater: the birth of a unified system linking science, the military and industry, were a model the U.S. would sustain long after the war. Research labs like Wright Field, corporations like Standard Oil, Shell, and Texaco, and civilian chemists worked together to create a seamless value chain, from laboratory to battlefield. It was, in essence, the world's first scientific war machine. The revolution in fuel chemistry didn't end with Germany's defeat. It ushered in a new age of aviation, one centered on energy, efficiency, and materials. The lessons learned from 150 grade gasoline laid the foundation for the jet age. Engineers who had developed wartime fuels went on to pioneer jet propellants like JP-1, powering the first generation of American turbojet aircraft in the 1950s. But the deeper victory was philosophical. Germany, brilliant in engineering yet crippled by scarcity and disorganization, fell before a system that knew how to mobilize every resource, from laboratories to oil rigs, from refineries to runways. America had turned something as ordinary as gasoline into a strategic weapon, as decisive as any bomb or gun. And when the war finally ended in the spring of 1945, thousands of P-51s sat silent on European airfields, their tanks still filled with purple fuel. The smoke of war was still rising, but in those last shimmering drops lay the essence of an era when chemical energy decided the fate of empires. Historians would later summarize it simply: Germany lost not for lack of guns, but for lack of fuel. Yet the fuller truth was this: America won because it learned to turn fuel into strategy. That mindset propelled its post-war dominance, from aircraft and automobiles to the very rockets that reached the stars. The story of the 150 grade fuel is not just one of chemistry or aircraft. It is the story of a civilization that learned to ignite intellect into power. For in World War II, amid smoke and steel, victory did not belong to those who fired faster, but to those who best understood what was burning in their engines. And in the European skies of 1945, as Mustangs screamed past at nearly 490 miles per hour, what people heard was not merely the wind, it was the echo of an entire industrial nation, the roar of America itself, distilled from oil, science, and the unshakable belief that even an invisible liquid could become the weapon that shaped the world's destiny.